Warning. 1.
It looks deep into your soul!
He screamed hysterically whilst making his way through the dark and confined tunnel toward us, moving as fast as possible whilst trying to keep his candle from dying. Oh yes, I remember it perfectly well despite how long it has been.
It's evil!
He yelled in my face as he made his way past us. He grabbed me by the collar with his free hand, looking me right in the eyes.
I know everything!
How could I ever forget?
Everything!
He started to repeat it over and over again and continued making his way out of the tunnel, leaving me a shocked and shaking mess. We could hear his muffled screams and ramblings long after his light had gone out of view. I looked at my friend and, without a word spoken, we started to make our way back out of the tunnel. It must have taken us hours to get that far, and I must admit that I felt strangely like continuing on to look upon that which had driven the other chap crazy. Could it really be that bad to know everything? We made it back to the crypt that houses the entrance to the tunnels without any sign of the other fellow. As we climbed out into the large stone structure, it was almost completely dark, and I noticed a strange sound from somewhere by the entrance. I pulled out my dagger and started toward the door. Our candle was blown out by a sudden gust of wind that blew in through the doorway. My companion also pulled out his dagger. The entrance to the crypt was right down the other end. There are 6 graves inside, and the entrance to the tunnels is hidden by the bricks at the head of the 6th one. I was somewhat curious as to how the other fellow had got into the tunnels, as the bricks were perfectly in place when we came yesterday morn, and the boards they were on top of looked as though they hadn't been touched for years. And there were no deviations from the tunnel we were following, I'm sure. My friend put his knife away and fumbled with a match to relight our candle. I too replaced my dagger to its sheath before we began to put the boards and bricks back in place, covering our tracks as best we could. The sound at the door was really starting to bother me now, as it seemed to have grown a lot louder and seemed almost like someone talking just outside the door. My companion seemed to be struggling as much as I to ignore the sound. Quick, constant stares in the direction while we worked. The dull morning sun was doing little to penetrate the open doorway, and certainly done very little down our end of the stone structure. The candle helped, but I couldn't see anyone or anything by the door. We done our best to make the entrance look as it had done before, even though we could barely see what we were doing. As we neared the door, I held my dagger ready for any possible danger, and my friend told me I was being paranoid, making a tighter grip on his own, one might assume, and shielding the candle from possible threat. We could hear the voice more clearly now, and it was beginning to sound like someone mumbling in some other language, unknown to myself. I asked my friend what he thought of the sound, and he told me thought it sounded like it was coming from only one person. He also said he didn't like it. Outside we saw the man curled up against the building, crying and mumbling into his sleeves, and when I went to talk to him he just looked at me straight in the eyes and then started to laugh. His eyes were like nothing I've ever seen before, so dark and hollow, filled with the insane fear of whatever it is he had seen down there in those tunnels. I nearly leapt out of my skin, I was so afraid of what I saw in his eyes. Truly amazing. He went back to his ranting, yelling extraordinary words in some strange language neither my friend nor myself had heard anything of before, looking at me yet somehow looking straight through me at the same time and completely ignoring my friend altogether. My companion asked me if I thought he would ever stop his madness, and I had to tell him that I did not know. As the man buried his head in his arms again, my friend proceeded to close and lock the mighty door to the crypt, and I found myself lost in the chatter and could not make myself turn my back to leave. I must have stood there for hours listening to him on that first morning outside the crypt. To this day, as much as 30 years later, he still cowers there by the doorway, ranting and raving and crying like a small child at times. We are very puzzled by this strange possession, and I must wonder how the man is able to live as he consumes neither food nor water, and his voice has not been silent that I am aware of this whole time. A few that we know of have gone to the cemetery to listen to these crazy sounds and the ancient words spoken as if one of the ancient ones himself. Some say they have deciphered them to mean glorious things, while others say it is the very talk of the devil. One tale is that a priest went there to save the poor man's soul, but when he started to pray, he burst into a huge ball of flame, turning to nothing but ash and blowing away in the breeze. Bless his soul. This theory is where my personal beliefs lie, and I know plenty of devils in which to believe, and my friend is, for the most part, in concurrence with my views, and our huge volumes of papers on this subject is a direct reflection of our joint works. Yes, we feel it is evil, just pure evil. Whatever is down there is far worse than any devil we've met thus far, and we've met a few, man, beast and darkly divine entity alike. Although the man looked older when we saw him outside the crypt than when he ran past us inside, he seems to have not aged since, and we wonder just how long he can live. Is it possible for a man to live forever? And although communication with the man is impossible, we have spent many hours, days, weeks, months at a time even, over the last 30 years or so just sitting with him, studying his every word, syllable, sound and gesture, yet we have found no trace of this strange language anywhere in the world. I feel that there is only one thing I can do now, only one way I can surely find out what he speaks of. Already I am starting to consider myself mad just for even thinking it, and my companion says there is no way he can allow it, yet I feel I must, even if it means my life. Two. I'm sorry, but Dr. Everstone will no longer be completing this diary, a diary I'd never seen before but found on his bed this very morn, exactly 3 weeks from that fateful, dreadful day. Despite my pleas, he had ventured into the tunnels to look upon that which had driven the other chap crazy. I must confess that our arrival was a somewhat strange and uneasy affair, as when we got to the crypt the man stopped his raving, sprang to his feet, then looked deep into the eyes of Dr. Everstone, completely ignoring my presence once again, then ran off into the cemetery, yelling of how he was free.
I'm free!
As I turned to look at my teacher, being sure the man would have changed his mind, he looked more determined than ever and told me to stay at the crypt and wait for him. I asked him one more time to reconsider, and he said it was too late. Even if he wanted to stop now, he would not be able to. He turned and walked into the crypt, stopped and pulled a match from his pocket, lit his candle and walked down into the open, waiting passage into the dark, deep tunnels below. As he disappeared into the darkness, I heard the most horrid scream come from the direction the other man had run off in. Pulling out my dagger, I went to investigate. Although the man had taken off running, he hadn't got far. I could see nothing of what could have caused his death, no blood or injuries, and the ground was completely undisturbed in any direction but the one we had come from. I dragged his body back over and into the crypt and sat on a rock outside to wait for the doctor. After a short time I looked inside the crypt where I'd put the body and it was gone. I reluctantly went inside to have a look, and there was no sign of the old man, No clothes, no tracks, nothing. It was as if he had just vanished. The hours passed by slowly and my fear was mounting by the second as the sun faded and the full moon rose with no sign of the good doctor. I was sure that when we went into the caves for the first time it did not take this long, as we had arrived early in the morn, and now the moon was in full view. The dark clouds were blotting out the rest of the sky and making the stars hidden from my eyes. A few hours later, when the moon was high above, I would have guessed it to have been about midnight or so, the doctor came quickly out of the grave, holding and shielding his candle most protectively, still alight and leading his way. He made his way quickly over to where I was standing in the doorway, and I moved back outside for fear he would crash into me as he was in such a hurry. Just as he came out the door, a small and very direct gust of wind blew between us. From out of the door of the crypt, it seemed, this foul wind extinguished the doctor's flame, wholly causing him to cast the candle and holder from his hand in disgust. Then his eyes snapped sharply to mine, and his glance held me for an eternity and told me of all the things he had seen. It was a frightful stare that must have lasted for hours. His eyes looked how I remembered the other chaps 30 years ago now to the day. He spoke but one word to me, "Sorry," before collapsing to the ground and breaking into tears in the exact same spot the other man had done so before. I didn't understand then, but I completely understand now what he meant. And as the years fly by, I feel more and more the urge to venture into those tunnels myself. I am starting to know that I must look upon that foul thing that has driven many men crazy over a time we may never know. This is where I must leave you now, as you know my fate as well as I. Maybe one day, before I take the walk into the tunnels, I shall go to the cemetery where the doctor rambles to this day. But for now, I have heard enough of the gibberish, and wish just to wait until it calls me back, as I know it will. Maybe when this time comes I shall write more of this journal, but for now I must put it away and do my best to forget about this whole mess. The doctor and I once uncovered a tale where a man had been cursed and knew his fate as well as I, so he tried everything he could to take his own life, but all attempts ended in some form of divine intervention, and the man was left completely unharmed. When he realised this would not work, he tried to flee the area, but all attempts to leave were in vain, and he ended up back one way or another, trapped, having to accept his fate and wait in nightmarish torment and anguish. I shall make it clear that in no way do I blame the good doctor for any of what has happened here.
Three.
It is now many years later, 30 one might assume. I can hear the madness calling. I can feel it devouring me entirely. I have not aged well, and am unsure if I'll be able to make the long journey into the darkness, yet alone back to sit on my new throne as the king of madness. I do not feel any fear, as I have had many years to prepare myself for what shall be the end of my part in this forever living curse. I look forward to the end. I don't care for the knowledge that will drive me to insanity. I look forward only to it being over. Now as I stand there at the door to the crypt, a lonely, shaking, broken old man, I steady my hand enough to write one final time. The doctor had looked at me upon my arrival with no idea as to who I might be, acknowledging me merely as his replacement and leaping to his feet, laughing his way further into the cemetery, yelling of how he was free. He will be dead in a short time. If anybody reads this journal whilst I am gone, or when I am a crying, ranting, raving mess on the ground, whatever you do not look me in the eyes and do not try to help me. If you do, you will suffer the same fate as I and many before me. Now I must go. Please do not take my words lightly, as I have seen this happen to 2 men and now shall be the 3rd that I know of. I sign off now as an apprentice to the good Dr. Everstone, a wise and caring man whose knowledge knew no limits. It was an honour to have learnt from him.